Hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar in our Cooling for COP26 webinar series being run by the Future of Cooling program at the Oxford Martin School. My name is Anant Jani. I'm one of the Oxford Martin Fellows within the Future of Cooling program. And today we are going to be doing the first webinar, which is looking at the role of the finance and insurance sectors in shaping the future of sustainable cooling. Generally, when you're looking at finance, you can think of a couple of different things. One is the divestment of funds from dirty coolant manufacturers, for example, the more toxic F-gases, as well as the proactive investment in companies that are promoting sustainable cooling. And then from the insurance sector, and this Jim, whom I'll introduce shortly, really sort of opened my eyes to. There's a critical function that insurance companies have of underwriting the manufacturers of sustainable or unsustainable cooling modalities. And so that, I think, is an important thing that needs to be addressed, as well as their role as an institutional investor. So divesting from the more toxic F-gas manufacturers. And this, again, was something that I owe to Jim. He pointed out that the insurance sector is one of the largest real estate holders in the world. And so if they changed the regulations around the insurance policies that they let for real estate holdings, they could overnight change the shape of cooling within buildings, whether that be active and or passive. So today we're going to have Jim speaking about the role of the finance sector in shaping the future of sustainable cooling. And then we're going to have Rich talking to us about some of the work that he's been doing in solar. He'll give an overview in the insurance sector and then talk about what he's done in solar. And then we'll sort of open it up for a more casual discussion. If you guys in the audience do have a question, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and the ask a question function. So please ask your questions via that function, and we will then relay those to the speakers or to myself. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Jim. Jim is a partner at Sustainable Development Capital, LLP, and he is currently based in Singapore, and he coordinates a grant from the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program that supports advanced cooling technology projects in Asia and Africa. And he has tons of experience in this domain, and he served as a tutor of sorts for me as well in this area. And he has an MA in Latin American Studies from the University of Texas in Austin, and a BSFS from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in the States. Jim, over to you.
Great, thank you, Anant, and everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. As Anant mentioned, I'm a partner at SDCL based in Singapore. What SDCL does, what we are, is a specialist investment and asset management firm, really focused on cooling and energy efficiency and distributed generation. But the DNA of the business is very much around cooling and energy efficiency. And what we are looking to do is develop scalable investment strategies. We are targeting value chains and sectors that will be responsible for, the greatest growth in the global economy. Just headquartered in London, and then with a global footprint, Asia, Europe, and the United States, with the exception of Latin America. So as Anant mentioned, I've worked very closely and represented SDCL in terms of a grant under the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. It's now known as the Clean Cooling Collaborative. And our grant was to deliver cooling and energy efficiency projects in Asia and Africa. What we're looking to do is deploy capital, equity capital primarily, or in the first instance, sometimes accessing or sourcing debt capital, but to look at emerging markets and improve the efficiency of cooling equipment in order to reduce pollution or to reduce the consumption and production of F-gases, right? Reduce HFCs amidst what certainly we termed in the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program the cooling imperative, right? We unfortunately live in a warming globe where extreme weather is daily more a part of our experience. And what we wanted to do is take some of that experience that we had in the US, in Europe and the UK, and to adapt that into Asia and Africa as cooling as a service, right? To introduce this business model into Asia, to sort of move off the typical shared savings, energy efficiency business model into more of, as I said, cooling as a service. What we saw and what we experienced here in the region, just briefly sort of to update everybody, is we were able to fund 24 investment grade audits. We were able to develop an actionable project pipeline of about 20 odd million US, with an aggregate pipeline over 400 million across 57 hosts, asset owners, et cetera, looking at north of 500 energy efficiency opportunities or projects. COVID in this part of the world definitively impacted our work over the last 18 months. We, from a hospitality perspective, we saw no travel, cost containment by hosts, and concern about the ongoing business in general without tourism. We also saw the erosion of credit quality in certain sectors of the economy. And that, as an investor very focused on long-term contracts, we saw the need to recalibrate a bit. And within the context of cooling as a service, we thought of a new strategy. And that strategy then was to move a bit towards distributed generation in the first instance, and then bringing in the cooling and energy efficiency. So what that sort of was in response to, and what we were trying to get ahead of, was sort of the if you will, the slowness of corporates in emerging markets, and as well the sort of the nascent aspect of cooling as a service in emerging markets, and get to sort of get in, if you will, into the discussion at a C-suite level, not just at a facilities management level, about how to recalibrate their energy utilization. And so specifically moving into Vietnam, we looked at rooftop solar in order to get into the energy or the cooling and energy efficiency. And that has actually been, again, until this latest unfortunate series of lockdowns in Vietnam, saw us move very quickly into the supply chain, in the manufacturing sector, and make some very meaningful progress, up to and including committing capital both in April and then most recently just a month ago. The issue, right, fundamentally what we're trying to get at, and particularly, and I'll speak specifically right now to Asia, is how do we address this cooling imperative, a warming planet, extreme weather volatility, amidst greater urbanization, which is more likely than not bringing greater use of cooling technology, right? Air conditioners and refrigerations. And what we're looking at is how do we bring the most efficient cooling technology into these emerging markets, right, of Southeast Asia particularly. So when we look at what is the opportunity, or what is the challenge and the opportunity, what we're looking at is about 40% of the world's energy is being used in buildings. And there is enormous inefficiency at this point in time, we feel, and certainly what Kigali is all about, is how to take the air conditioning and refrigeration in this part of the world and make it more efficient, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to use lower GWP refrigerants in the technology or in the plant and equipment which is being operated in this part of the world. And that's, fundamentally, when we're looking at countries, within this sector of hospitality or manufacturing, or in the commercial industrial space, we are, and IEA figures estimate up to 1 billion new air conditioners could be deployed over the next 5 years. And demand for cooling is potentially, we're looking at a tripling by 2050. So this need to address greater efficiency also brings, but very much what we felt as an opportunity for us as a financier, as an investor in this space, the chance to deploy capital. We deploy equity capital We do it on a cooling as a service model, right? So we would own the cooling equipment, and we are selling, if you will, electrons or cool air to the host. We have seen the need to work with local banks, as well as multilateral lenders to help in this process. We're looking at driving local solutions. We as an investor, we're technology agnostic. We're looking at best in class, but we are agnostic as to the actual technology that's deployed. And we tend to look at this from an investment grade perspective. We're looking at counterparty credit risk. We want performance guarantees and warranties, right? And therefore, as we went through our work under the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, what we looked at, what was obviously influenced by COVID, but what were the really important aspects? We looked at parental guarantees. We're in the realm of global hospitality as an example, but we're dealing with asset owners who are specific to a given country. We're looking at innovative risk-sharing guarantee structures. So we spent a lot of time in engagement with multilateral lenders, everybody from the ADB to the OECD. We looked closely at energy savings insurance, right? How to deploy performance guarantees, or how to address the issue of performance guarantees by the deployment or backstopping with insurance products, or perhaps better termed, financial risk management instruments. We looked at how, from a rooftop solar perspective, how to minimize the downside risk. So companies, and you'll hear more, such as Kilowatt Analytics, and up to and including then looking at political risk insurance. So a little bit of what just the mechanics were and what we went through in these last 18 months, 2 years, is funding investment grade audits, looking at the energy efficiency measures which are derived from those audits, and then deploying capital, right? We work typically with the global OEMs, so it's the Johnson Controls, the Daikin's, the Honeywells, et cetera. And we're looking at always trying to deploy the best-in-class technology and the lowest GWP refrigerants. The markets, and I mentioned a couple earlier, what we were targeting was manufacturing, hospitality, healthcare, and then last but not least, and of course, obviously importantly, that property and that real estate sector. So to try and deploy some of the successes that have occurred in Europe, in North America, in terms of energy efficiency, into the emerging markets of Asia, principally Southeast Asia, and develop a greater sense and awareness of the need to reduce the production and consumption of HFCs to improve the efficiency of cooling technology in this part of the world. And as Anant mentioned, I'm sitting right now in Singapore, and I can assure you that it's been rainy and fairly warm for most of the last 7 days straight. So when we looked at the need to sort of target these specific sectors, the issue then became, how do we do this in perhaps a different way that had been done previously in this part of the world, in Asia? And so what we were looking at is distribution strategies. How do we get scale so that we deploy capital in a way that is standardized across markets, right? So we looked principally at as I mentioned, hospitality. We looked at the supply chain. We look at engaging global operators and asset owners. So our work with, for example, energy services companies or the EPCs was very much rooted in having an opportunity that was scalable. And secondly, or thirdly, we also looked at the opportunities related to the banks and the insurance companies. Because what we see, particularly on the lender side right now, is a strong push towards ESG, or a strong push to net zero carbon lending. On the insurance side, we've seen a bit of talk about it, but certainly not the same level, again, what would reflect my personal opinion, the same level of commitment as the banks are showing right now. And so what we wanted to do, though, was work with the insurers and say, you're a large asset holder in real estate, let's work with your local, with your own assets, but then let's look at your clients, right, the insurance. And many of us would argue and see that there's an intrinsic relationship between cooling and energy efficiency and the insurance sector, right? Because we're talking about the built environment. How do we make sure that an asset is better risk managed? And there is a fundamental thesis that when you exercise or when you execute a cooling and energy efficiency project, you are improving the risk management at that asset. Where is, one of some of the outputs, though, we've seen over the last 18 months, 2 years, and again, just to be clear, it's been a very challenging market with, in this part of the world, particularly with the overlay of a pandemic. But here's a couple of sort of, reflections on our last 18 months, 2 years of work, and how do we get the Kigali Amendment implemented, right, ratified in countries, and how do we get a greater sense of awareness of this need for improving efficiency in the cooling sector? A couple of things that I'll highlight. One, what we've seen very much in this part of the world, and I alluded to it earlier, is that solar is sexier in Asia. When it comes to replacing a chiller at an asset, typically people would prefer to talk to you about either rooftop solar or distributed solar. Okay, and from a creating scalable distribution opportunities, that becomes a barrier. It becomes a hindrance to really getting to cooling and energy efficiency at scale. Secondly, we see this issue of extreme weather risk around the region, but we haven't seen really the insurance industry, I would suggest, step up in a way that is meaningful. And alluded to it. How are we looking on the investment side of an insurance agency at their investments in coal-fired power stations or coal mines, et cetera? That needs to happen. There's, I think there's clearly an understood risk link between the weather and the emissions. And what we need to sort of recalibrate, and I think in this part of the world particularly, is how do we bring cooling and energy efficiency forward, investment into at scale to start to address this issue of weather risk, because it is very real for us in this part of the world, particularly in terms of heat and drought. Reducing the consumption and production in terms of HFCs, we've got to get that right. One of the other discoveries through the course of our work over the last 18 months, however, is we also need to look at how do we get the waste management of the HFCs? How do we get these refrigerants handled in a meaningful way? Because consistently across the region, we were getting anecdotal feedback that certainly on a lower level, if you will, as SME level, we were seeing continued venting, and that's clearly unacceptable. And we can move forward with all the wind farms and all the solar farms that we want, but if we continue to vent HFCs, we're not going to get to where we need to be in terms of addressing climate change. And that's super important, because when we think of the Kigali Amendment and cooling efficiency, the more successful we are, the potential for the increase in what are termed banked F gases, right? And the KSEP estimates were somewhere around 53 gigatons of banked F gases. We need to address that. And as Kigali really gains traction in the region, we're going to need to sort of better understand the management of that waste, because what we don't want is continued venting, and we certainly don't want to see a situation where the banked F gases continue to grow, and yet we're not addressing how to manage that waste. We saw a lot of innovation, a lot of discussions about innovation and around technology. We had some big win. We had a very nice win, I'll say, in Hong Kong with regard to air conditioning, cooling technology, which was a homegrown solution. And part of the objectives within the Kigali Amendment is to create conditions for greater investment in and achieve meaningful increases in the efficiency of the air conditioning, so chillers to split levels. From the finance side, we engaged a lot of the communities in different countries, how to get deployment of capital at scale, equity versus debt. But we also worked with insurers to try and get meaningful use of that contingent capital, and probably ultimately weren't as successful as we wanted to be. And then I would argue, in this part of the world, we always look at cooling and energy efficiency kind of as a one-off, and a focus is we'll get in and do that energy utilization. So from a business model perspective, what we feel is an opportunity and an opportunity to succeed going forward is to look at that sort of combined dual approach of looking at rooftop solar and energy efficiency, particularly in the supply chain, where global retailers, global parties who have large manufacturing footprints in this part of the world, their focus initially, right, as I said earlier, solar is sexier. Their focus is really on the solar, but what's important is to understand how energy is utilized and the need to be more efficient in our cooling. So I think the parting shots, I'd say, just to wrap it up, we are here in Asia. We are very much in the firing line of climate change and/or that change in the weather, from typhoons to droughts to extreme heat. And from our perspective, sitting in the region as an investor in this space, we feel very, very comfortable that here in Asia is where we need to be because of the challenges that are out there. There is a substantial ecosystem which is developing in Asia in this space. ESCOs increasingly across the region, both global players who are here in Asia, but certainly national or regional players. I think they understand the objectives of the Kigali Amendment. They understand the role where third-party finance can come in, and I think that that's really important to look at this new model, the introduction of this new model, not a shared savings traditional. Let's kind of argue about the monitoring and the verification, but a third-party financing structure whereby we are providing cooling as a service. What I would say, I think it's important that the corporates in the region really start to get their game going. They need to mobilize, and they need to realize that the discussion is no longer one for the future. It's very much now. And then last but not least, I'd say, the role of the multilateral lenders, the ADBs or the IFCs or others. I would argue that this is it's very important that they come in and look at how they can play a meaningful role in terms of this issue of non-payment risk or counterparty creditworthiness across these emerging markets. If we look at the hospitality sector in Thailand or Indonesia, these are sectors of the economy that are large employers and that have been just slammed in the pandemic. How we get more comfortable as an investor in that counterparty creditworthiness is important, and it's very, I think it's very doable for multilaterals as well as the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry to come in to support the investment into cooling and energy efficiency and distributed generation by the introduction of these financial risk management instruments, by the provision of contingent capital, which hopefully will unleash a greater level of investment in this space. And I think I'll stop there, Anant. I think I've probably done just about where I needed to be, and I'll hand it across, or back to you, or across to Rich.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Jim. That was excellent. And several questions that I've jotted down, which I will ask when after we've heard from Rich. So I'm now going to hand the mic to Rich. So Rich is the CEO and founder of KWH Analytics, which uses performance management information about renewables to help clients decrease the risk and increase the returns on their renewable energy portfolios. And Richard is also a graduate of Georgetown University, their School of Foreign Service, and is also a Forbes 30 Under 30 award recipient. One of the things that I forgot to mention is that we have quite a few distributed time zones here. So Rich is actually in Honolulu, so it's evening for him. So thanks very much to Rich for joining. So Rich, over to you.
Not at all. Thanks for having me on, and thanks a lot, Jim. I was going to say, before I dive in too far, given that Jim's in Singapore, the first thought that comes to mind is the legendary founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was asked before he passed, what was the most important invention of the 20th century? And I'm sure this group likely already knows the answer, but his answer was air conditioning. And it's not just because Singapore is, of course, a notoriously hot and humid place. I think upon reflection, it becomes quite clear that without air conditioning, the modern conception of what an urban existence would look like, cities would not really exist in the way we understand them if it wasn't for that invention. So I really think that, of course, what we're talking about here is a very important topic. Maybe one question I'd want to see for Jim, maybe not for exactly right now, but given the importance of the work involved, like what would it take to scale up the work that SDCL is doing by 100 times? I mean, in your remarks, you pointed out a couple of different pain points, right? One would be counterparty credit, another might be a policy, a third might be around technology standards, M&V. There's a couple of different pieces there, and of course, as far as we can get a better understanding of where the biggest roadblocks are, and perhaps that'd be valuable for the discussion. But going back to what Anand had described with regards to some of the areas that might be helpful for me to add to. So, when I think about the insurance, well, taking a big step back from insurance, right? So if you're trying to scale up anything, and I mean anything, you're really looking for three types of capital. And so you're looking for equity capital, debt capital, and contingent capital. Contingent capital is really another name for insurance. And so without all three of these things firing on all cylinders, you're never going to scale up any sort of technology, whether it be cooling to solar to anything. These are three things you solve for. And each of these three things feels a little bit different, actually. So it's helpful to think about the problem on a slightly more granular level. And so when I think about insurance specifically, I'm reminded of what an old mentor described once. He said, look, equity gets paid off the promise of future returns. Debt, however, looks at the world as how has this performed in the past? So it's really using that historical data as their primary lens by which they understand whether or not investment's a good investment to make. And having not come from the insurance industry, but having had to innovate and create some products in this space, I can say with a great deal of certainty that the insurance markets look at the world much more as a lender would, as a debt investor would, which is utterly unsurprising, right? I think that you and I just intuitively understand that when an insurance company is offering you an auto policy, it's not because they're taking a leap of faith here that they believe that you are going to be a great risk, right? That's not how they think about the world. Rather, the way they look at the world is they have data on 1 million other drivers, and 100,000 of those drivers share enough similarities with what you as a driver will likely perform at in terms of auto accidents, such that they're actually willing to take on that risk. So it's intrinsically a backwards-looking view, using that historical data to inform the risk that they're willing to take on. And so when we think about the insurance market, I actually really think that getting that third piece of the stool up and running is fundamentally a data problem. The question is, how do you get the data in place such that an insurance investor, right, and someone who's issuing an insurance policy, has the confidence needed so that if they put out an insurance policy saying they'll guarantee you against this liability, that they can reasonably and accurately quantify, the downside risk, the expected payout that they should expect to see, over the course of that year or even 10 years. So with that framing in mind, perhaps I'll use that as a jumping off point to describe what we at KWH Analytics has done. And of course, then we can expand the conversation from there. So I started this company about a decade ago. And the founding thesis of the company had nothing to do with insurance. Instead, we were started as this, really the belief that this renewable energy space, specifically in solar, would need an experience for that space. And I know that, I'm sure that in the UK, you probably don't have the silly FICO score that we do in the United States, but at least in the United States, you can't qualify for a single financing product unless you have what's called a FICO score, in other words, a credit score. And Experian is like the largest firm that's been providing the data used in these FICO scores. And so I had the privilege of meeting Van, who is the CEO of Experian, and he was the one who told me that, like, look, if solar becomes as big of an asset class as you claim it's going to become, someone will do what we Experian did for consumer credit, but do it for renewables. Because look, every asset class, at least in the United States, has some third-party data repository that plays that role in that space. Without having a firm that does that function, you're just never going to get to scale. And so that gentleman invested the company, joined our board, and really helped to push us in that direction. And so fast forward in time, what we've done is we've built two things. Like, one is the data business. The second is this insurance business. On the data side of things, that's where we now have data from 30% of the solar power plants in the United States are feeding us that data with regards to how they perform, as Anand had mentioned. So it's 300,000 discrete facilities. It's the largest database of renewable energy asset performance out there in the world. So that's on the data side. And then what we've done with that data is that we recognize that there's an opportunity to create a new type of insurance product. And there's a risk that the insurance markets were historically not particularly comfortable taking, that with this level of data, we believe that there was, in fact, an ability to confidently take that risk and therefore fill in a gap that the market was not able to fulfill. And so what we've done is we've created this new product called the Solar Revenue Put, guaranteeing the electricity generation from these solar power plants over a decade plus period of time, We then partnered with Swiss Re, the world's largest reinsurer, to have them lend the strength of their balance sheet. And in partnership with them, we've now insured more than $3 billion of solar power plants, all in North America. And of course, I'm happy to describe that in further detail. But I think the important part of that anecdote perhaps is, I oftentimes think that, of course, history never repeats itself, but it certainly rhymes. And when I think about what we've done in solar, I got into solar in 2007. So of course, solar is in relatively early days today, but especially back 15 years ago, even earlier then. You can see that there's certainly been patterns emerge in the way that solar has developed, which even that was resting a little bit off of how wind had developed previous to that. And I'm sure that a number of these sort of energy transition assets are going to start riffing quite a bit off of what we in solar have learned. One of the things that we've learned in solar the hard way, which I'm hoping that this space is going to be able to leapfrog past very quickly, is that in the early days of solar, the way that we got adoption, we as a market was able to achieve at least distributed generation adoption, was through venture-backed firms. So Solar City, Clean Power Finance, Sunrun, there's a number of these at the time startups that were financing these solar power plants, but they're not using it with debt. They weren't able to access debt, as Jim was describing. Because they weren't able to access debt, because they weren't able to access cheaper equity in the form of infrastructure fund kind of investments, they're actually financing these solar power plants with venture dollars, which has an embedded cost of capital in the 20 to 40% range, depending on how you think about it. And that is no way to scale an asset class. And it is incumbent upon every single energy transition asset to figure out how do you may need to start there simply because there's not enough critical mass to attract the lenders and the insurance community that you really need to scale a solution. But we really need to find ways of getting past that stage as quickly as possible, because you're just never going to scale if that becomes like a primary source of funding. And so with that, perhaps I'll pause there and hand the mic back over to Anand, so you can lead us into the discussion.
Thanks very much, Rich. Yeah, that was super, super interesting. I have several questions. There are a couple of questions in the audience as well. I'll ask my questions, and we can turn to the questions in the audience. I think the difficulty for me is picking which question I want to ask. I'll ask maybe a two-pronged question, kind of tying in some of the stuff that Rich has described and that Jim talked about as well. Number one, which is to say is maybe a simple question, but maybe difficult to answer. Can we see cooling as an asset class? Should we see cooling as an asset class? Just laying out some of the stuff that Jim mentioned earlier about temperatures increasing, et cetera, and the demand potentially increasing like crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll tee off on that. I think very much so. I mean, one of the struggles going back a decade, north of a decade even, was to define energy efficiency as an asset class. So, I mean, we're looking at as a model, which is if we talk about cooling as a service, we're looking at a model which is built on energy as a service. So, I think very much the concept or the idea that this is an asset class, it's a new emerging asset class. Some would probably argue it's an old asset class in some respects. And this is industrial upgrading by any other name. What we are proposing is that there's instead of waiting for annual capex for a factory or a building owner, we're looking at third-party finance to do that. We own the asset, we sell them that that cooling as a service. So the model is slightly different. I guess, if you will, the backdrop, I think, is pretty well proven.
Rich, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, going back to yeah, go ahead.
Certainly, I think that, of course, I'll defer to Jim here. Like, I think that what we would like to have is for clean cooling to become an asset class, and I think there's a number of challenges embedded in that step ladder to really becoming an asset class. So the first is that comes to mind is standardization, and I think this is where what Jim had started teeing up on, that there's likely some challenges here, right? Like both from a credit counterparty standpoint, perhaps from a varying technology standpoint. There's, at least in solar in the United States, we've now hit a level of uniformity, wherein, at least when it comes to residential solar, that the contracts are relatively standardized. If you're going to get a lease loan or PPA, you're changing a couple of key terms, but look, as a market, we've all agreed that this is what these contracts look like. And as a result, it's just easier for the finance people to start putting large dollar volumes to work because you know what you're getting, right? There's not a sense that every contract is a bespoke, tailored, to the specific needs to either the counterparty or to the financier. So yeah, I think that there's, at least I can imagine there's likely some challenges that we're still going through to really get to that point where I think everyone around the table might be able to say it's an asset class.
That's great. Now, I was going to hold myself to two questions, but this has sort of sparked another question. So maybe a sub-question related to this, and then I'll ask my other question. So like you did, Rich, you were saying historically for solar, where it was an emerging asset class, and obviously it's within the broader umbrella of energy efficiency or clean energy. And I like the framing that you've mentioned of maybe framing it as clean cooling. And related to this and to Jim's investments in and providing cooling as a service, this is a general question. Are there any databases, going back to what you were describing of Experian, of the efficiency or performance of cooling as a service providers that exist on the market? And does there need to be, if this is going to be a growing asset class?
I'll refer to Jim on that one. I'm not aware of one.
Yeah, so and I think, and I'll just say, I think there's not specific to cooling, but I think the person who I think deserves a huge shout out in this discussion is Professor Nils Koch, who was formerly at Maastricht and then was at Berkeley for a while, and I believe is still at Grisby. And I think what he saw early on and the work that he did was to identify the fact that buildings which go through an energy efficiency retrofit typically have better leasing terms, they'll have higher occupancy rates, and importantly, they'll have a higher valuation at resale. And what Grisby represents, what our Grisby is an independent repository of collecting that information now globally, up to even out to Australia. I know they've got people based in Australia. So I think it's getting there. I don't think it's necessarily in an Experian level of value right now, but it's got to get there. And I think this is where the insurance industry has potentially an important role to play. When we talk about property insurance, which is kind of the bread and butter for most of the industry, we're talking about the built environment. We're talking about assets, and they should be contributing to that discussion exactly, as you've indirectly alluded to. I spoke in Washington, D.C. about 2 years ago, and U.S. Green Building Council was there, and it was the lead guy, and I asked him, what's your engagement with the insurance industry? And he said, well, we've got a guy who sits on our board, but he doesn't come to the meetings. So there's the built environment has to sort of, whether it's from the investor level and then the insurance level, we've got to sort of come to a new understanding of what is the value of having a retrofit building. Do we believe that a building that goes through a cooling and energy efficiency retrofit is an intrinsically better risk managed asset? The data that and the work that was done by Professor Koch suggested that there was certainly a higher value to it. So I would, based on my experience of 25 years in the insurance industry, I think you're there.
Yeah, Jim, I was building on that. So if you could wave the magic wand and the insurance community could take like one key risk from your deals, like what would you want that to be?
For me, Rich, from our investment perspective, we would look at the counterparty credit risk, and that's as an investor, that's where we in an emerging market. We're not in Chicago or New York or San Francisco or whatever in the developed world, or London for that matter. So for us to talk, we as part of our Kigali work, we went into the hospitality sector in Bali and Thailand. We conducted investment grade audits. And we had massive savings in certain projects, north of 40-odd%. As the impact of COVID was hitting, though, the erosion, the deterioration in the credit quality of those assets, it became a non-starter for us. And that's what I mentioned in my opening remarks. Where do multilateral lenders come into this discussion? Where does Asian Development Bank come into these discussions? Or importantly, if we look at the hospitality sector, where do the global brands fit in this discussion? Right? Because again, if you look at hospitality, largely in this part of the world, asset owners will be national entities, will be individual owners, right? People who own a Hilton or an IHG asset, branded asset. Where do the global brands fit in this discussion? I think is a really important point that needs further elucidation.
That's fascinating. I was going to say that that credit counterparty risk problem you're describing, I can imagine how you can, from an insurance standpoint, look, Jim taught me everything I know about insurance, so this is for me, this is also a learning opportunity. So of course, there's political risk products. There's already some trade credit related insurance products that one could use. Like, what are some other tools that might be more promising, that if someone on the line here is listening, that they might try to invent a new product that would be de-risking your transactions?
The key is energy savings insurance. It's looking at both the performance and the credit, and where the insurance industry, I think, needs to move in terms of cooling efficiency is where the lender community is going. The lender community is very much focused on net zero carbon lending. We as a firm, we are a big E in ESG, right? We're a sustainable infrastructure investor. And oddly enough, I think the insurance industry, and what got me interested in cooling and energy efficiency was a white paper from Swiss Re and Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, 1997, and they put forward the hypothesis, right, or the thesis that a building which goes through a retrofit is an intrinsically better risk managed asset. Now you'll see the lender community saying, if we want to be a part of you because you're a big E, right? You've got solar, you've got X, Y, or Z in terms of renewable or renewable type of business, and we're going to discount. We'll give you we think that this is the type of business we want to be a part of, and we'll give you preferential lender terms. The IFC has done a fantastic job with a solution called EDGE, which is basically a monitoring and verification. And if you are EDGE certified, you will then be available to better or preferential terms in terms of your accessing capital. The insurance industry is not there yet. There's one company, a U.S. company, Chubb, which has done an Internet of Things digital solution, but that needs to be scaled. That needs to go global. And I have, to my knowledge, that they're about the only one that's looking at this right now. So there are some companies which, in bits and pieces, are trying to do unique or special products for offshore wind. But this needs to become, as you've mentioned, Rich, this needs to become a part of anybody who wants to retrofit a building. They need to know that there's 1, 2, 3 solutions that are available to them to help them get through that process.
I'm going to jump to a question from the audience, and I'll save my question for later because I think it ties into what you guys are discussing right now. This question is from Alex. Can you give a concrete example of exactly what the risk is that needs to be insured from the point of view of the insuree? And I guess maybe, Alex, I don't know, maybe putting text into your question, but I think this might be directed at Richard, maybe for solar, and then maybe we could riff off of that to see what the risk would be for cooling as well, potentially. Cooling as a service, as Jim and SDCL provide, or maybe even these cooling modalities.
Sure, and I'll ask the question in more of a framework so that we can start using that, because it's going to be applicable across the board. So at the end of the day, any investor in any of these infrastructure projects is looking for one thing, right? Cash flow. And cash flow, at least in solar, is very straightforward. It's price of electricity times the quantity of electricity. Effectively, will give you your cash flows. And so on the price of electricity, at least the way that our industry works is that there is some counterparty. There's someone who, whether it be Google or the utility, someone, usually a large entity, will say, I'm going to buy the power from this solar power plant for the next 20 years, and here's the fixed price that I'm going to be willing to pay that for that power. And so therefore, from price and quantity, price is well spoken for through this contract called the power purchase agreement. So that's on T. The Q is the quantity of power. And historically, there's not been investment grade, or rather meaning guarantees that a lender or an equity investor could really count on the quantity of electricity generated from the solar power plants. And one can appreciate the nuances as to why, right? Solar, at least in terms of a commercially available technology, it's really in the last 10, 15 years that this has really taken off. And so from the standpoint of, if you're a lender, the idea that, yes, a hardware manufacturer, that the guy who made the solar panels tells you, like, look, these panels are great, and look, I'll warranty this with my own balance sheet. But look, a lot of these hardware manufacturers go out of business. So if you are the owner of that solar power plant, or you're the lender to that solar power plant, that warranty from a manufacturer that historically a lot of these guys go bankrupt is not sufficient for you to really feel comfortable in the quantity of electricity being generated. And so at least the product that we generated, our first product for the solar space, is putting a floor on that megawatt hours generated. And so by having a investment grade counterparty standing for the price risk and also an investment grade floor on the quantity risk, one was able to create a firmer profile of cash flows coming out of the asset. And if you have a firmer cash flows on the asset, that means that lenders are more comfortable with it, equity is more comfortable with it. There's a lot of benefits in terms of being able to attract more capital to that asset when there's certainty associated with that capital. So maybe I'll use that pause there, and of course, Jim, go ahead.
No, I think one of the I'll just give an example. We just had a discussion with regard to the United States with assets that are in the central part of the United States, and one of the specific issues which came out, to Richard's point there, in impairment, debt service repayment impairment is what nobody wants, and particularly the lenders. But one of the issues that we discussed was, is that exposure to storms coming off the Great Lakes, or is that tornado risk coming up through the central part of the country? So I mean, the easiest product to cite is really simply the insurance of those assets, particularly assets which are in high natural catastrophe exposure areas. Because, and again, this is I come into this as an investor from the insurance industry, and the issue, quite simply, is frequency and severity of extreme weather. And I would encourage any of the listeners just to look at the insurance statistics, and you see some clear trends. And the beautiful thing about the insurance industry is they actually use color-coded charts typically, so you don't even have to be very smart. You just have to look, and you can read the colors. It's a really fundamental issue that we as an investor, we don't want to watch assets wash away. We also don't want to see our revenue stream impeded or impaired.
Great. Folks in the audience, please do keep your questions coming. So this was the other question that I was going to ask, and that's around the use of passive cooling. So, you're talking about more energy efficient active cooling modalities and using cleaner coolants, et cetera, but you're still using stuff, right? What are the commercial prospects, do you guys think? Obviously, from a company's perspective, you're not generating continual revenue. So to Richard's point about cash flow, when you have active cooling, at least you're generating some semblance of cash flow. With passive cooling, it's a one-time sort of fixed cost investment. Are there any sort of mechanisms whereby passive cooling can be more practically integrated into cooling as a service modalities and be more widely introduced and scaled?
Yeah, so I'll step in first, Rich, if you don't mind. So I think from our perspective, we are, as an investor, we tend to want to invest in capital equipment or capital, plant and equipment, and we have not. So just to be clear, we've not looked as aggressively at passive cooling. There are solutions, though, that we feel that can complement the replacement of a chiller or improvement of HVAC, or that type of if you will, more direct and more active investment. And that's really the in this part of the world where we think that there's a market for that is going to be in the area of cool roofs, It's gotten a fair amount of press within the Kigali Amendment, within the Kigali cooling efficiency program, and that's where we think, for a relatively small investment relative to the replacement of chillers in a large asset, we think we can get a little bit extra bang for our buck in terms of the savings. But strictly speaking, Anand, from this concept of passive cooling, it's not where we as an investor are focused right now, because we think there's a lot of work to be done in and around HFCs and improving the equipment.
Do you think it will, before we turn to Rich's comments, just from a very practical perspective, do you think passive cooling retrofits on existing buildings, for example, or integrating passive cooling into new buildings, do you think, the problems that you're seeing in Asia in terms of, the heat and all of that sort of stuff, do you think they're even a practical solution, or do you think we just need to bite the bullet and say, actually, active cooling is the only thing that is going to help us in this situation?
Well, I'm going to qualify this response with, I'm not an architect, and I'm not, we're not looking at this closely. I don't want to say no. That it shouldn't be a part of what needs to happen in this part of the world, because I think in certainly in what we've seen as a participant in Kigali, there's a lot going on and discussed in terms of countries like India, for example. But if we talk about Asia and we talk about Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, Singapore, Hong Kong, we're talking about urban centers. Ho Chi Minh, these are large urban centers. And the trend towards urbanization is such that the use of, to get back to Richard's opening comment about Lee Kuan Yew, absolutely, the role of air conditioning. We will see, and I think I gave that statistic from the IEA about the increased billions, not hundreds of millions, billions of air conditioning units. So from our perspective, what we need to do in this part of the world, SDCL's view, we need to make sure we're investing where plant and equipment is the most efficient, and we need to make sure that we're investing where the management of the waste, right, from that refrigerant is most diligent, because what we don't want is venting of chillers and air conditioning units.
Just one quick follow-on to that. Eliza from the audience just sent this in. How about absorption and adsorption cooling using free available heat, for example, heat and process heat?
So we have not looked at that. It's been discussed within the Kigali teams, but our focus as an investor in this space right now, and again, we think that there's a massive addressable market. The total addressable market in this is massive. We are trying to take a laser focus into chillers, cooling equipment, HVAC systems, and distributed generation. Because again, we feel that's where our background and the investments we've made in Europe and the US, that's where we can best leverage our experience and our expertise in terms of this objective to improve efficiency across the built environment.
Thanks. Rich, your thoughts, comments on this?
Sure, briefly. So I think at least the experience that we've learned in the US has been, there was some serious attempts made to try to take passive cooling as being like part of a broader suite of tools that these solar firms were using to try to increase the size of the bill that they could, the share of wallet that they could take once they were working with a given client. So most notably Solar City, before they were acquired by Tesla, was selling solar, yes, but while they were selling solar, they said, look, while I have you as a homeowner's attention, I'm going to go do an audit of your house. And when I do that audit, I'm going to see if I can add in, here's the 5 or 10 things we think we can do for you. And it turns out that problem ended up being so difficult for Solar City that they ended up throwing in the towel. That even once they had the customer acquisition challenge solved by using solar as a lead, that the difficulties of just the customization of so many different things needed in order to deliver passive cooling, but also some of these other innovations into the home, ended up being too significant. So I wouldn't be too surprised if that's just a structural problem for the space in general. I think that the space that Jim is describing, which is more of like an industrial use case, or like perhaps like an office sort of use case, I can see there just being greater scale available. so that you can actually dedicate the resources needed to deliver a solution.
That's really great. Thanks. Last question, mindful we have 4 minutes left, comes from Alex again, and it touches on an interesting, I guess, equity dimension. How do you get AC or cooling, let's say, to where it's needed most, where people are very poor, in places like the Indus Valley, where the wet bulb temperature has already reached impossible to survive levels, if only for a few hours? I mean, my background is in health, and one of the things that we're exploring is seeing, is cooling actually a health intervention, or should it be seen as a health intervention? Because, people can't survive in some of these places. And we saw in California, on the West Coast, this year when the temperature went so high that they were actually having air-conditioned buses sort of driving around so people could just sit in the bus for a few hours. In New York, I think last year, the public health department was actually providing air conditioning units to some of the poor residents because, it's just, again, to Alex's point, it becomes a health and survival issue. Any thoughts from you both on that?
Rich, I'll tee off, and then because I think it's a fantastic question, and it's what we have looked at is what is called transportable solar, and it gained a lot of attention because of COVID, right? Because when we look at certain countries, the infrastructure for your healthcare systems, it's not where it should be. And so we looked at the use of transportable solar and microgrids for vaccine storage, right, for cold storage, and that came out of Kigali. And in fact, one of the first issues that Kigali was raising was, how do you improve the cold chain? Because as Alex is mentioning, if it's rural Indonesia or islands in Indonesia, or it's rural India, I mean, how you're going to get a diesel generator? The cost of the fuel alone is going to be insurmountable on a continuing basis. So I think first off, that's where what I alluded to, the need for public-private partnerships in this discussion is absolutely fundamental, both because of that COVID counterparty creditworthiness, but because the role of a governing entity and a multilateral supporting the introduction of cold storage is going to be crucial. We, as an investor, cannot do it at scale, certainly in the way we would want to. And again, we're a private equity firm. We're not a not-for-profit. The issue is really so topical, and that extends across Asia, Africa, and then Latin America as well. And so, from a food security perspective, from a healthcare perspective, getting transportable solar scalable in these countries, I think, frankly, is where Kigali, what it certainly did was raise that to a level of attention, which is certainly we had, as an investor, hadn't really looked at previously. So I think you're going to get, there needs to be that intervention as this moves forward, as this whole discussion moves forward. It's a great question.
I guess just Rich, you may not have specific experience with cooling, but maybe with energy poverty and the role of solar and maybe addressing energy poverty. Have you looked at that at all in your work with KWH, or is that sort of beyond the scope of the work that you've done?
So at least there's a couple of colleagues in solar that have, in particular, the way solar has been interacting with the BOP seems to be primarily through the use of solar plus an appliance, so solar plus a light, solar plus a refrigerator, that kind of thing. And I guess what's really interesting to me is that I didn't appreciate how large of a problem the credit counterparty issue has been for the GEMS kind of deals. And of course, what many of these firms are attempting to do in the solar space, in Gaza Design, there's a number of these firms, is that they're attempting to use their product as a means to collect credit data, because customers are paying them, of course, for the privilege of using that light or that refrigerator as a service, and so therefore being able to start some of the first credit data repositories in those markets. So hopefully solar ends up leading the way and smoothing the path for these other innovations to follow.
So I think we're out of time, but this has been fascinating. Thanks so much, Jim and Rich, for coming on in your various time zones and accommodating the UK European audience. This was, again, just really, really fascinating. Virtual round of applause for you guys. I'm just going to very quickly mention that the next webinar will be on Monday, 20th of September at 9 a.m., where Janet Stevenson and Russell Hitchens will talk about the social interactions in cooling cultures, which I suppose touches on some of the demand side issues that you guys talked about today. So with that, I think we can close, and hopefully Gemma can tell me what I need to do, if anything, to close. Otherwise, thanks very much for attending.